All right, so hello everyone. So this autofocus is finally working. So okay, so today, so I'm probably going to do some live coding regarding the Info React project, and give you some example of how to use effects, and then lifting of states. Mostly, like I'm basically going to um, demonstrate what you need to do in assignment 5 in kind of like a simpler way. So with that in mind, let's just start. So it's going to be simple slides today. So just to recap, well, let's just recap the whole thing that we did. Like the first thing that we learned was JSX, right? And then we learn props and functional components, right? And then we learned state, the state variable, how to use state, and how React monitors state variable, then properties. And then whenever it changes, whenever these value changes, it's going to trigger render function automatically. And then basically render function is the functional components, right? Oh, is mic working? Okay, no. Hello? Okay, mic is working, cool. Okay, so, and then we saw handling events, which is basically inline attributes. And then we're just gonna review and repeat some of the stuff that we did last time. So yeah, let's create a new project. So hopefully by now you know how to create a new project. So let's say I'm gonna do npx create React app, and then demo April 27th. Again, takes a while. So, and if you remember, but basically what I'm trying to do is almost exactly the same with the specification. So yeah, this is what I did now. So I'm going to install jQuery. I'm not going to install MongoDB and Express because I'm going to run server in a different folder. And then, so proxy is basically, the reason why we are using proxy is that, like, only simple reason is that the Create React app is going to run a node server in its own folder, but we need a separate server to retrieve data from the Mongo database. So we're using the server.js that we used in assignment 4, and then we are using a different port for that separate folder, separate server. And then we use proxy so that whenever the app that we're creating, the React app that we're creating, make a Ajax call, is going to reroute to this 8080 server program that is running in this separate port. So to do that, you have to change the package.json. So I just created an empty project. So I'm going to go in 7, and then if I start, it is going to open up that localhost 3,000, and then show us the default app, and then hopefully by now you are pretty familiar with this. Just gonna load the time. Hopefully I'm gonna do a shorter lecture today. Okay, so what else do I have to do? I'm just gonna quit the project and then install jQuery. So it's going to be in npm install jQuery save. So the reason why I put this option is to add that to the package.json. So let me actually show you what it looks like. So if I go to this folder and open it, it creates like a default package.json, and it requires a bunch of node module already. But we're going to install jQuery and see how this changes in real time. So if I save it, install it, see, and then here it's going to create a jQuery. Now we have jQuery, which is good. And then what I'm going to do is add a proxy. So I'm going to grab this guy. For you guys, you would have to use 8080. I'm going to use 8081 only because we are using assignment 4 code. So assignment 4 code, like I don't know if you remember, but like it was using 8081. So I don't know if you, so like basically we are running the assignment 4 code already. So if I go here, we have task working, to-do list working. Okay, but then like basically, but what in assignment 5, you are just doing it, you're just going to do it in the same folder, which is why you have to install MongoDB and then Express, so that and then, so you open up another terminal and open the Node.js server, and then it will act like a database server. But we don't need this. Like this is basically assignment 4 code. What we're gonna do is this guy. But the because of the proxy, if we in this React code, if we make an Ajax code to localhost, it's gonna reroute them to this assignment 4 server.js code, so that it will we can fetch task data. Okay, so let's start modifying this thing. So always you go to app.js, and then this is the thing that is rendering. So I'm gonna say hello world as always, and then save it. And then it looks like it has some error. Oh, we're not running the thing anymore. I would have to run the React project. If I run it, I'll get the hello world thing. So, and then probably it's going to complain about logo not being used. This is basically this is warning. So it's not an error, but it's a warning. So let's just get rid of this guy. So here, you didn't have to do this because I asked you to replace the app.js, but to be able to use jQuery, you would have to import it. So again, $sign is the like $sign is a function, jQuery function that you can use for selector or like Ajax code, so basically everything. So I'm gonna import $sign from jQuery, and then this is name of the node module that we installed. So if you go to node module, it's gonna have jQuery. So hopefully now you understand the not module package memes that we presented, that I showed you in one of the lecture slides. So here we have jQuery. So if I save it, I get the same thing. And then it's complaining that like $sign is defined but never used, but we're going to use it later. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually like create a kind of like a simplified to-do list using the server, so that I show you how to fetch data using AJAX-Call. So what do I do? So let's just name it to-do list, simple to-do list, and let's create components. So I'm going to create a to-do list, and then let's create a functional component. Function, I always have the same typo. And then this is basically the render function of to-do list. These two has to match, and then whenever React think it needs to render this particular HTML, it's going to call this function and then get the return value and then use that as an HTML. So I'm going to return HTML or JSX to be precise. So let's for now simply add hello. Okay, so and then let's check out the inspector just to make sure there's no error. So let's fetch data. How do we fetch data? Hopefully you remember this. So it's going to be $sign get, and then we want to know the endpoint, and then getting the data is fetch task for assignment 4. Once you get it, once it's done, I'm going to say, hey, print out the data. So the first parameter is going to contain the data, right? Object.data. And then if it fail, and then it's going to print out the response text. We have like second and third parameter, but like it doesn't matter too much in this context. So I'm just going to do this. And so what are we doing here? I am making an AJAX call inside the render function, right? So whenever it renders, it's going to run this particular code and then fetch data. So I saved it. So let's look at I have an error. So this is I think this is the server. Let me just start over so that it's clear. Okay. I have to close it. Okay, so this is the server, server.js. So if I refresh it, it fetches task in the beginning, because when you open a page, it's going to render this particular functional component and then call this function. So that's fine for now. So let's just create data. So let's check out the data. Like, let's check what kind of data that we got. We got one task. Let me create one more task. Because I'm not implementing new task, I'm just going to use the assignment 4 to generate tasks. So I'm going to say my new task, and then maybe add new due date and no note, so submit it. Okay, so if I refresh, now I have two. I got new task coming from the Mongo database, which is great. So let's render them. Okay, so one thing that we talked about is how to use array. Using array to render multiple components. So this is array, right? Like this is array, and then what I want to do is render JSX out of this. So I introduced the like map function to generate JSX component. So before we do that, like let's just create another functional component. So I'm gonna do the same structure with the assignment file, but I'm gonna call this simple to do item, and then return. And I'm gonna have a properties, and then whenever simple to do list to do item is defined, I'm gonna pass title and then due date. So let's do div, or let's do li, because you know li is a list item. So here I'm gonna do props title, then by, and then now we have to print out the due date props due date. Okay, so now I have it, and then it doesn't do anything because I haven't used this simple to do item. So here, when Ajax Ajax received data, Ajax got a response from the server, I'm going to generate the list of simple to do items. So here I'm going to say, hey, I need a new array. It's going to be, I'm going to map object data, which is this guy. And then I'm going to map this into a new array. And then I would have to provide a mapping function. And the mapping function is going to take parameter, which is each element or item, let's say task, because we know this each item in this array is task. And then we would have to return corresponding element for each item in for the new array. So here I'm gonna actually send simple to do item component, and then we would have to define properties like attributes, like because it's expecting title and due date. So title is going to be task title that we just got. So task is basically the first parameter of this mapping function, which is each element of this array. And then what do we need? Due date is task.due date. And then we would have to close it. So that is new array. Let's call it constant because we're not going to alter the value. So what do? We would have to add this to, as part of this to the list rendering, right? So one thing we can try, so because it is, this is essentially a bunch of like li item, list item, I can expect we will need a ul tag. And then we want to add this array here. So let's put new array. I do that. it I have some error return. The new array is defined, not defined. So why is it giving me an error? Because this particular variable is available only within this scope, right? So what do we do? Okay, so what do? We can create the variable outside this function because we're going to alter it, like we're just going to call it this way. And then if I do that, it's going to happen. It's not complaining anything, but it does not update. Why? It is because like React does not know whether they have to like render this to-do list functional component when new R is updated, because we're not using state variable, right? We have to use state variable. So again, state variable and props are the only, like basically those are the hooks. And then hook function means that you are connecting certain types of variables, either state variable or props to React, so that React know that it is time for updating or it is time for rendering this particular components because like we got some new changes. So I'm going to use state. So I don't know if you remember, so, but the main way to define state is to create a array that has variable name and setter. So instead of new R, I'm going to call it task, and then set task is this is the setter, right? So you have to use this setter so that the React will know, oh, task variable is being updated. Otherwise, we will not know. And React will not know. And then you will have to reuse state, and then initial value is going to be just empty array. If I save it, it's going to complain about use state is not defined because we would have to import it from React. And then now I changed the new R to task. So, okay, so that's good. And then there's something wrong. And here, the other problem is that I'm supposed to use, so this is basically a new array that is returned by a map function. To set it, I would have to use set task. So it's kind of like a long function call, but this is what we need, I think. Okay, so basically we are updating the task like state variable using the setter that is defined by the use state. And then like, what kind of array is this? Like, basically we are translating, like mapping this array to new array, which is the element of each element of which is simple to do item. So now let's see what's going to happen. If I save it and then refresh it, then let it go. Error. Oh, we don't need this guy anymore because this is the setter itself. So let's refresh. Oh, we got some stuff already. I saved it. So what's happening here? I don't know if you noticed, but this is basically infinite loop. If I go back to the server, this is being keep fetched all the time, infinitely, even though, this is being stuck at some point. So something wrong with this. So I'm just gonna comment this out here and save it, refresh, and it does not solve the problem. So I don't know if you see it, but it's an infinite loop. So let's check out why. What do I do? Let me actually comment this out. Refresh. Okay, so now it got fetch data, but it doesn't update infinitely. And then if you see here, this is not being updated. So what happened? So let me explain what happens. So last time I briefly mentioned about a few ways to make an infinite loop. And this is basically this one, fetching data in the top level. Top level inside functional component. So let me tell you what's happening. So what's happening here is that basically an infinite loop, like, let me actually draw. So this is rendering function, right? So what happened is when render function runs, there's multiple different ways, but then, well, like the basic things that we have to understand is that whenever is, initiated, another case is whenever there's updates, especially for state variable and then props. By the way, to-do list does not have any props, right? So it is being updated. So let's say the first time it's going to render this, right? I mean, it's going to run this function, and then it is fetching data, and then it rendered here. But after fetch data, Ajax call is going to run this callback function, and then as part of this function, a state is being updated. So what happens if state is updated? It's going to call this function again, and then this function make an Ajax call, and then render it, and then once render it, like when the data comes back from the server, it's going to update the set. It's going to update the state variable, and then because state variable is updated, it's going to call the render function again. So that's how you can create an infinite loop. So what do we do? So to be able to control, this is called side effects in React, where there are going to be some side effects, like when a certain thing is rendered, certain components are rendered. So this is useful, like use effect is going to be useful. So so sometimes you want to do something which is basically side effect after a component is rendered. So what we can do, like the way to think about it, is that initially it's an empty array, but if you are done with the rendering, like done with the rendering empty array, why don't we just fetch the data from the server and then get the new data and then render them again? So use effect is kind of useful. So it's again like the same thing. This is a use effect is hook function. You would have to import it like this. So so the first parameter of use effect is going to be callback function, which is going to run whenever rendering is done. So so basically which one is the fetching part? Like basically from this line to this line. So what I'll have to do to use effect is use effect and then create a callback function. So I don't know if you can see, but this is the callback function of use effect. And then inside the use effect callback function, we want to fetch data. So this needs to go inside here. All right, so, and then again, we're not done yet. So remember, use effect takes one callback function and then it calls the function whenever rendering is done. So it's again same kind of infinite loop in a different order. So whenever to-do list is created, it's going to run this. It's not going to run this particular callback function, right? Because rendering is not done. Like this is the callback function, but like it's going to go down, and then okay, so it's going to return the JSX element, and then because rendering is done, now it's going to call this function inside use effect, and then realize that hey, state variable is updated, so I would have to call this rendering function again, and then go to the end and then render them, and then because rendering is done, it's going to call that function again and so forth. So how do we control? How do we control use effect to be able so that we can run it in exactly the time that and when we want it? So use effect take the second parameter. So you can tell React to skip applying an effect, which is basically running the use effect callback function if certain value haven't changed between re-renders. To do so, pass an array of props or states as an optional second argument to use effect. It will run callback function only when these variable value changes. And if you pass empty array, it will run only in the beginning. So let's save it, and then let me show you that this is running. Okay, you would have to import it first of all, save it, and it's keep making infinite loop. So that's not good. So what do we do? So it's kind of hard to see, but let me actually decompose this. So I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to create a function. Function is called fetch data. And then the first parameter is function handle, callback function. And second parameter is the array of variables that you are going to keep track of. So if I do this, and then empty array it means that it's going to run only in the beginning. So, okay. So it runs only in the beginning. It ran only one time. And then now we have two tasks that is coming from the the server. So here, so let me actually add one more thing. task, newer task, and then I submit it. Now I got the new one. And if I go here, I don't have a new one, but if I refresh, I'm gonna get the new one. Okay, I'm probably better to use some substring. Okay, so let's do some substring here. Let's, I'm gonna change it to string. And then substring from 0 to 20 maybe. Save it. Okay. 20, 19, 18, 17, 16. Maybe 15. It's gonna only have this up to year. I don't know why I have semicolon here. Okay, so that is basically to-do list. This looks awful, but you know, you have a title and then you have a due date and so forth. So, and then you notice that like it is complaining about like, hey, each child in the list should have a unique key prop. So I haven't really introduced this, but basically React, when you generate a list, and then when you have a, like when you want to render multiple items using the list, that that list item should have a key property. So something like this, and then we have a good candidate for key property, which is basically underscore ID. So if you go here, every task has underscore ID, right? So I'm going to actually use that as a key. So here I'm going to say, hey, key is equal to task dot underscore ID. And then now it's not going to complain about these. So let's look at the element actually. So let me actually look at this. And then it has basically this li item is generated by this guy, and then we're not using key, but like React use key property to find, or like, you know, exactly find what they need to update. So again, when you generate multiple items using array, it's going to complain. I mean, unless you add a key. And the key is not necessarily index. It's like kind of like a unique string for each data point that we have. Okay, so that's good. But what else do we need? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new components. So let's say toolbar, which is kind of the same thing that we have. Function toolbar, and then toolbar, the only one thing that toolbar has is gonna be a button, and refresh. So now we have refresh button, so it doesn't have any function yet, but basically what I want to do is like something like this. So how can I have that? So first of all, we would have to create a event handler. So I'm going to use onClick, and then provide the function handle, click handler, and then give it a click handler. what should we do? We should do alert, clicked, saved it. So if I click it, it's going to give an alert message. But that's not exactly what I want, right? So what do I want to do? What I want is whenever this is clicked, I want to be able to fetch the data one more time from the server. So here comes the trick of lifting up the states. So here's what it looks like. If I draw a hierarchy of this app, on the top level there is app, right? On the first level, under that, what else do we have? We have, of course, we have div, but let's just ignore this. We have h1. Then we have toolbar. Then we have to-do list. So here's the problem. The refresh button is here, but where is the fetch function? Fetch function is inside here, right? So how can I, when this is clicked, how can I tell to-do list to update the data? So basically this is the case where one node has to communicate with sibling node, right? To do that, I introduce lifting up the state. So the way that it is supposed to communicate with this to-do list is basically lifting up the state and then talk to the to-do list through this app or through this parent. So let's see what it means. So here, what am I gonna do? What I'm gonna do is, when this is clicked, I'm going to lift the state, lift up the state. So let's look at the lifting of state from the last lecture. So how do we lift up the state? Pass a handler function as a property and call it whenever you have something to tell parent. So pass a handler function to a child. So again, if I draw it again, it's kind of like you have an app and you have a toolbar and you have a to-do list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a function, which is handler function, and then I'm going to provide this function handle as a property value of this guy, so that toolbar can actually call this function. I don't know if it makes sense, but let's try. So I'm going to create a function on the parent. So here, hey, function, and then what I'm going to do is refresh handler. Refresh handler. And then what it's going to do is basically collect 2 and then saved it. And then when I'm going to use this function handle to toolbar as a property. So it's going to do handle refresh or refresh handler. Well, it's the same name, so I'm going to call it foo maybe. So foo is basically refresh handler. But then toolbar now has a property called foo, and then whenever this is clicked, I can either call directly props.foo, or I can keep using this and then call props.foo inside this handler. So let's try this. So if I click it, I see clicked, which is part of this guy, but we're still in the same component. If I let go, now it went up, like, you know, because this has a function handle of this particular function is gonna call this guy. Okay, so we lift up the state from toolbar to app, and now what do we do? Now what we have to do is tell this guy, to-do list is the component that has fetch data, right? So fetch data is going to run whenever side effects needs to happen, which is basically right now we're not keeping track of any variable, so it is going to run only in the beginning, but we want to run this whenever you get a signal from the parent. So what kind of how can a parent communicate with the child? Again, property is a great way for parent to communicate with child. So I'm going to create a property called refresh what should we call it? Refresh counter, and then we would have to have a variable, some sort of variable. So I'm going to name them foo2, and then I'm going to say refresh counter. Now this we have to have a variable over here. So what do I do? If I do let refresh counter is equal to 0, and then what I'm going to do is increment this guy, which means that like it's going to tell you how many times this refresh button is clicked. So if I do that is not going to work. Of course, like this alerting function works, but it does not fetch data. It only fetches in the beginning, right? So it does not fetch data again. Why? It is because there's no reason React has to re-render this app one more time whenever refresh is clicked. The only way for us to tell React to update the component is to update state variable or props. So this needed to be state variable. So I'm going to use state, refresh counter, and then name of the setter, refresh counter, and use state, and initial value is going to be 0. And then whenever refresh button is clicked, this is, you know, this function is going to run, right? So whenever this refresh button is clicked, I'm going to update the refresh counter with the setter function, and the new value is going to be previous value plus 1. And then let's see what happened. So let me actually inside the to-do list, I'm going to have a message. You clicked refresh button X times. And now props has refresh counter times. Well, you never know whether it's going to be singular or plural. So I'm going to do a conditional rendering, which is if this is if props refresh counter is greater than 0. If it's greater than 0, I'm going to put S. If not, I'm going to put nothing. So, oh, actually, it has to be greater than 1 because that's what plural is, right? Props is not defined. 39. Okay. So we need props now. So that didn't work. Why? So yeah. Oh, the refresh counter is initially 0, but refresh counter was not the proper name. The proper name was food2. So let's use food2, food2. So now it's 0. If I click it, so you see how it's working. So again, it's hard to visualize, but this was one element of app, like one child node. This is another child node of apps, and then this is app, the whole thing. So how did it happen? Whenever refresh is clicked, it's going to call a function inside app, and then app is going to update the state variable of app, and then that state variable is used as a property of to-do list. Again, so whenever toolbar basically has one function. Whenever this is clicked, it's going to click call the click handler, and then click handler is going to call props.food, which is basically a function handle of like this guy. And then what it does is essentially like update the setter. I mean, using the setter function, it's going to update the state variable. And then because this refresh counter was used as a property of another child node, it is going to re-render this whole thing. Obviously, to-do list is going to be re-rendered. This is going to be re-rendered. But then it does not fetch data because we're like calling fetch data inside use effect, and then we ask them to run only when when you render it for the first time. So so how do we actually call it when something changes? So here it can take the array of like the variable that is the React is going to monitor, which is basically this guy, props food2. So now if this variable is different from the previous value, is going to call useEffect. So let's try. Right now, it fetched the first time. If I press refresh, it's going to fetch one more time, fetch third time, fourth time, and so forth. Again, why is it happening? useEffect has callback function that is going to run whenever rendering is done. And second parameter, if you don't want them to run all the time whenever rendering is done, what we can provide is the array of variables that React needs to monitor to call this side effect function. So now it is checking this foo2, which is coming from the app or the parent, and then foo2 is basically a refresh counter, which increments only when this refresh button is clicked. So now it's going to refresh. So let me actually refresh it. It doesn't work. Let me actually create one more task. Hey, does it? Refresh. And then if I submit it, now we have 4 different tasks. And if I refresh, press the refresh button, it's going to have the new task from the server. One more thing, maybe I can get rid of it. Get rid of another one. And then if I refresh, well, right now we have 4 tasks. If I refresh, it's going to get rid of the 2 tasks that we deleted from the server. Okay. So I think that's about it. So, okay, useEffect hook is a function that you want to call when rendering is done. So by default, if you don't provide second parameter or second argument for the function, the first parameter is the callback function, and it's going to call the callback function whenever rendering is done. But in case you don't want to run callback function all the time, what you can do is provide a state variable or property variable that you want to keep track of, and then whenever this particular variable value changes, it's going to run this function. So basically, React is going to keep track of the value of this variable, and then when rendering is done, it's going to compare whether this has changed. And then if it's changed, it's going to call that run the callback functions. All right, so I think that's it. Again, there's multiple different ways to create an infinite loop. So one way is like, having the setter inside the rendering function, because, setter means that updating the state variable. Updating the state variable means that rendering again. Rendering again is calling the render function. And then if you have the setter inside the render function, in the top level, render function is going to create this infinite loop. Typically, if setter wants to be, you want to have setter inside either callback function or event handler. Well, event handler is basically callback function. So I don't know, like we have this set task setter, and set task is running inside this callback function, and then again, fetch data is something that runs only in a certain cases, so it does not have like an infinite loop. Another setter we have is set refresh counter, and the set refresh counter is something that runs only when refresh handler is called, and then this is called when the button is clicked. Okay, I think that's it for today. Well, obviously there's the different ways to do it, like, so like this is refresh, counter, and then you can do the same thing with overdue and hide completed task because you have to communicate with sibling. You're going to lift up states, which is basically by giving a child to um, giving a child handler function of the parent, and then so the child can call the handler function of the parent, and then that handler function can update the state, and then that state could be passed to property of the other child, and then the other child will be rendered again because property is updated. All right, so I think that's it. Um, I'm gonna have a announcement today, like on Tuesday, about tentative. I mean, like not the tentative grade, but like um, how you guys are doing in terms of grading. So we graded up to assignment 3, and then you can kind of expect. You should be able to anticipate what kind of grade that you would get based on the grading so far. And then I'm going to tell you how to calculate um, the rest of the grading. All right. So, and then we are working on assignment 4 grading. Hopefully it's going to take about, we'll be able to return the grade within a week or so. And yeah, I think that's it for today. And yeah, that's it. Well, thank you very much, guys. See you on Thursday. Bye-bye.